Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and welcome to another episode of Al-Mawrid UK podcast. We are back with our young scholar Shah Zuberi, and today he will be talking to us about the concept of Qira'at al-Ammah.
Thank you. So we'll be discussing Gandhi's theory of Qira'at al-Ammah. Now, the reason why this is an important discussion is because, as we will later establish, there isn't actually a canonical hypothesis present in the Islamic tradition or Western academia that accounts for what was being read in the non-Arab world. Now, this is not an introductory lecture or an introductory session on the ikhtilaf of the Qiraat. I am assuming a lot of foreknowledge on part of the viewer because this is simply to further clarify what Javed Ahmed Ghamdi and his students have been saying and to perhaps substantiate it further. Now, the Qiraat al-Amma question that Ghamdi raises is what was the reading of the masses? And the question of which Quranic recitation alone possesses mutawatir authority. Now, before we delve into Ghamdi's own ideas, we'll first have to look at what the tradition defines the Quran and its qiraat as. So, the structure of the argument is as follows. We'll first be looking at the theoretical framework, the definition that has been given to the Quran, and what the Usuliyin say vis-a-vis tawatur and ijma, and why the canonical qiraat do not straightforwardly meet that standard. The second is the historical diagnosis for how a Shafi's distinction between ilm al-amma and ilm al-khassa displaced the communal reading. Why that was able to hinder the general norm of the Qiraat al-amma. And why we won't find any mention of it in the non-Arab world, and why the Qiraat was generally confined to obscurity in literary circles. That is, the Qiraat al-Amma was confined to obscurity in literary circles. The third is we will be looking at the positive case for Hafs. That is, why does Ghamdi say that Hafs and Asim's Qiraat represents the Qiraat al-Amma? Why is it that this specific Qiraat is what is identifiable as the only Qiraat with tawatur? And then lastly, we will be answering objections that have been raised on this hypothesis, namely the Ottoman thesis, manuscript evidence, the presence of the 1924 Cairo Codex, and the argument from microvariation. Now, this, as I said, is not an introductory lesson. This will be assuming foreknowledge. So, with that out of the way, let's begin. The theoretical framework. What does the Islamic intellectual tradition and the scholars of Usul say about the Quran possessing ijma and tawatur? So, ijma is the first foundation. That is the total consensus of the companions as the first generation who had been given the Quran, who had been given the Quran by way of naqal kaffa and al kaffa, that is, transmission by all as against through transmission by a few, which is naql ahad. So, ijma is total consensus and tawatur is perpetual concurrence or riwayat bil kasrat. And in this, we will identify why the 7 kirat or the 10 kirat or the 15 kirat don't have ijma, nor do they have tawatur. So, Al-Jassas says, the way of validation of the Quran is naql al-kafa, transmission by all as against naql ahad, transmission by a few. So for him, the Quran is that which has been transmitted by the masses, not that which has been transmitted by a few people here and there. So for anything to classify as the Quran, it must have been validated via naql kafa. In the same manner, the Book of God is that which is transmitted to us between the two covers through perpetual concurrence composed of the 7 famous huruf. This is the legal definition that was given by scholars like Al-Dabusi, Al-Bazdawi, Al-Ghazali, and Al-Sarakhsi. And they independently converge on this definition. What this tells us is that the scholars of Usul demanded that whatever is known as the Quran must have ijma and must have tawatur. If it doesn't have that, it will not count as the Quran, no matter if it has a solid chain. Now, the benefit of having mutawatir transmission that has been carried forward by consensus is simply stated by Ibn Taymiyyah. If someone tries to change anything from the Masahif and presents it before the children of the Muslims, they will know immediately what the Musaf has been changed to, even without comparing it with other Masahif, because they have the Quran memorized and they will reject it. So essentially, Tawatur and Ijma allow for a discursive tradition that actively destroys and dissipates disagreement and controversy. There has to be total agreement, and if any mistake is being made, then that can be rectified immediately. And furthermore, no one can collude on a singular lie, because this is an entire generation of people that are transmitting it forward. It is logically impossible for such a vast amount of people to have colluded on anything without variation. So Ibn Khaldun says, and this is particularly crucial. The Quran is mutawatir among the Ummah, yet the companions transmitted its reading through different paths in some words until seven specific paths were established, whose transmission was also mutawatir, attributed to those famous for their transmission. So Ibn Khaldun differentiates between the Quran, that is the Musaf al-Usmani, and the Qira'at of that Musaf. He differentiates between those. He says both are mutawatir. However, there are only seven whose transmission has been established as mutawatir. As I will later demonstrate, Ibn Khaldun was not an expert of Qira'at. He was not an expert of Ulum al-Quran. He was an expert of historiography, certainly, but he was wrong about this. As Zahabi, Zarkashi, and Ibn al-Jazari, the foremost scholars of Ulum al-Quran and transmission of knowledge, none of the seven qiraat or 10 qiraat or 15 qiraat are actually mutawatir from the Prophet. They may be mutawatir from their individual qurra, but they are not mutawatir from the Prophet, as tawatur demands that tawatur be present at every stage of the transmission, from the very first, that is, Prophet to the companions, till the generation right before us and to us. Tawatur must not have arisen somewhere in the middle of that transmission. It should have been there from the very beginning. So, do the canonical qiraat meet the Tawatur standard? The tradition's most rigorous authorities say no. Now, Az-Zahabi is not an expert of Ulum al-Quran, but he is an expert of transmission. He is an expert of Rijal. He is an expert of the general transmission authority based ilm that Muslims constructed. So he says simply that the claim of tawatur cannot be sustained. And he says this as there are many readings whose tawatur is claimed. But with difficulty will you actually get hold of those which are not ahad. That is, you'll find a lot of readings about whom tawatur is being claimed, but if you actually investigate their chains, you'll find out that they were only transmitted with concurrence after a certain stage. They didn't have tawatur from the beginning. We read them because they have been generally accepted, that is, they have ijma upon them as being valid, but he who claims they are mutawatir negates observation. The crucial point here is that Zahabi is saying they are still read because they have scholarly acceptance. They have the ijma of the scholars. But this is the same phenomenon as we have seen with Bukhari or Muslim, where it is argued that even if a chain among these books is weak, it will be accepted because these books have generally been accepted by the scholars with ijma. He is making more or less the same claim about Qiraat. Then we have a Zarkashi. Now, a Zarkashi is the author of Burhan fi Ulum al-Quran. He is without question an authority on the subject of Ulum al-Quran. He says that they are mutawatir from their readers, but their tawatur from the Prophet is questionable. He says the seven readings are mutawatir from their seven respective readers. That is, the qiraat of Nafi is mutawatir from Nafi, the qiraat of Hafs is mutawatir from Hafs, the qiraat of Hamza is mutawatir from Hamza, and so on and so forth. However, as for their tawatur from the Prophet, it is questionable. The isnad chains in the Qiraat books constitute one person narrating from another, that is Naql Wahid, and do not fulfill the condition of tawatur at all levels. This is because the chains that have been attributed to these seven readers and more only go back to seven companions, eight companions, nine companions, or at the very most 10 companions. That is not Naql Kafa. That is by no definition Naql Kafa, but certainly not by the definition of the Usuliyin. And then lastly, this is something that troubled Ibn al-Jazari. Ibn al-Jazari is regarded as the last proper authority on the subject of Qira'at, after which the ilm or fun of Qira'at in the Levant became lost. He was devising conditions for what precisely an acceptable Qira'at is. He abandoned the condition of tawatur entirely, replacing that with something else. So he imposed tawatur as a condition and would negate many readings validated by the seven Imams. But he realized, and he says this, he realized that this is not straightforward and that none of these qiraat actually possess tawatur. Hence, he substituted it instead for grammatical correctness, conformity with the Osmanic rasm, and the soundness of isnad within general scholarly acceptance. That is, once again, if the isnad has ijma on it, or if the isnad is mashur, that is, it has shura and has generally been accepted by the scholars without any grievance, it will be read on that basis, not that tawatur existed with these qiraat. Now, what this framework establishes, this establishes that according to the scholars of the Islamic tradition, specifically the normative Sunni tradition, tawatur and ijma are attached to the Usmanic text, that is, to the Rasm-e Usmani, not to any recitation. The text is settled, the recitation question is not. The second finding that is established through this is that the canonical qiraat, by the admission of a-Zahabi, a-Zarkashi, and Ibn al-Jazari, do not meet the tawatur threshold. They are validated by a lower cluster of criteria whose scholarly acceptance, rasm conformity, and sound isnad constitutes their acceptance. So the question then remains open. Which recitation represents the Naql Kaffa and al-Kaffa alone that meets the Usuliyin standard? What is Jassas referring to? That is precisely what the theory of Qira'at al-Ammah addresses. In fact, before we move on, I'd just like to point out, Ar-Razi is one of those people who actively insists that the Quran must be mutawatir. Fakhruddin Ar-Razi, author of Tafsir Kabir. However, even he must acknowledge that the seven Qira'at are not mutawatir, and that there is an amount of disagreement found. So this is a historical problem, first and foremost. This doesn't have bearing on whether or not the Quran is preserved, because everyone acknowledges that the Osmani Rasm is preserved. Even Western academia will now admit that barring minor scribal variations, scribal mistakes here and there, the general rasm of the Mus'haf was agreed upon, and all of it in totality was passed down, and scribal errors were caught and fixed, and that the text of the Quran itself is preserved. The question we are addressing is what the status of the Quranic recitation is. Now, this is the second part of this presentation, and that is the historical diagnosis of how the scholarly qiraat came to displace the communal reading, that is al-Qira'at al-Amma, as the primary reference point for Quranic authority. This debate goes back, as many debates that we talk about do, to the pivotal moment found in Ash-Shafi'i's Risala. Ash-Shafi'i institutes a differentiation of the two kinds of knowledge. Now, Ash-Shafi'i's Risala is the first proper book of usul. To my knowledge, I don't think it's correct to say that Ash-Shafi'i invented these rules or he formulated them. I think he simply codified the manhaj of the Ahlul Hadith the same way Aristotle codified the laws of logic. They had been in existence prior to him codifying them, but he had simply formalized them as a framework. So I have a Shafi'i's Risala here, translated by Keshia Ali, who I will be referring to for this. So on the chapter of knowledge, which is on page 151 of my edition, a Shafi'i says, someone asked me what is knowledge. He replied, knowledge is of two kinds. Knowledge of the general public, which any person who has reached his majority and who is of sound mind may not ignore, like the five prayers. And that God is owed the fast of Ramadan, the pilgrimage to the sacred house if one is able, the alms from their property, that is zakat, and that unlawful sexual intercourse, homicide, theft, and wine are outlawed. God's servants are legally responsible for them. They must understand them, perform them, give them freely of themselves and their property, and refrain from doing what is outlawed. That is, these are the things of religion that are part of the zaruriyat of deen. These are the things which are linked to every Muslim, whether a normal person, whether a scholar. Every person has to know these, and every person does know them. Why? Because, first of all, they are badihi. And why are they badihi? They are badihi simply because this category of knowledge in its entirety is found in explicit texts in the Book of God and is widely extant among the adherents of Islam. And he qualifies why this is the case. Great masses of them pass it down from the great masses of them who went before, relating it from God's emissary. That is, Imam Shafi gives us the first formal definition of tawatur, that is nakal kafa and al kafa, great masses to great masses, and that this must be present from the Prophet of God himself. That is, tawatur must be present, nakal kafa must be present from the generation of the companions onward. It cannot start in between the chain of transmission. It must be there from the Prophet himself. So, this constitutes ilm al-Ammah, knowledge of the general community, self-evident, badihi, what every Muslim knows and carries, and it cannot be overridden by specialist scholarship. This last point, that it cannot be overridden by specialist scholarship, is my insertion. Imam Shafi has no problem reconstituting ilm al-Ammah in light of the second category of knowledge. But the Qira'at al-Ammah belongs here. So does Sunnah Mutawatira. The second kind, he argues, is the subsidiary obligations that apply to God's servants. And the reason for this is that this is, according to him, something for which there is no explicit scriptural proof text, and for the most part, no explicit account of a practice, even though some small part of it might be covered by such a practice, which would belong to the category of reports within the competence of the specialists. That is, this is something that normal people do not have access to. This is something that normal people are not going to talk about because this deals with speculative reasoning. This deals with an analogy. This deals with the ilm of the Muslims. This isn't linked to normal people. Normal people will not know about it. And vice versa. It is crucial, he says, that for so he says, forgive me, this is a level of knowledge to which the general public does not have access, nor have all of those specially concerned with it been charged with it. As for those specially concerned with it who are able to have access to it, that is the Ahlul Ilm, that is the people of knowledge, that is the Khawas, the select, the intellectual elite, if a sufficient number of such people takes it up, then those others who omit to do commit no transgression, as this is farz-e kifaya. That is, so long as a select amount of people preserve this knowledge and work upon it, there will be no problem. And the general obligation of the community will be discharged. Now, with this framework, I'm going to show you why precisely the scholarly qiraat were absorbed as ilm al-khassa, why the ilm al-amma was not, and what precisely the relationship between the two is. So, ilm al-khassa, just to once again clarify, is transmitted through particular scholarly channels, ahad in nature, requires sanad, matan conformity, and scholarly evaluation. Authoritative in its own domain, but a different epistemic category from mass communal knowledge. The scholarly qiraat were absorbed here. Now, there's a structural parallel. I mentioned something known as Sunnah Mutawatira, which Ramdi Sahab qualifies as plain Sunnah. Now, keep something in mind. If something is something is mutawatir, something is has been transmitted by nakal kafa, then By Shafi's own admission, it is something that is badihi, it is something that is self-evident, correct? Therefore, does it actually need a specific qualified chain? The answer does not. Because if you look at the normative practice of prayer, you will find that normal people, the amal throughout Medina, throughout Kufa, throughout most of the Islamic world, has always been to pray without rafa yadain. However, you will not find a single marfu riwayat attributable to the Prophet that details him praying without rafa yadain. Even though rafa yadain by definition is ahad, it is transmitted via sanad, but you will find over 400 narrations, 500 narrations. If you count the narrations of the companions, thousands of narrations that detail rafa yadain being done in prayer. But not a single one is found on the authority of the Prophet which says one does not pray with rafa yadain. This tells us that the Ahad hadith was prioritized over the mutawatir communal practice of Muslims generally in matters of narration because their normative practice didn't need to be narrated. It was badihi, it was established. With ahad riwayat, the reason why they have a chain is to establish them, which is why their chains will be documented, and whatever is badihi, whatever is ilm al-amma will not, because that is already established by Nakal Kafa.
So I think this is what we were
Yeah.
discussing earlier as well,
Hmm.
that we were discussing this concept of newsworthiness, right? This is
Yes.
news that is reaching us. These are reports that are reaching us,
Yes. That are
and
not established.
yeah,
They have to be established.
yeah. So you know, things that are reported, they tend to be things that are, yeah, they are different. They
Yeah.
are they are unusual, or they are, as we said, they are kind of newsworthy in a sense. So that's why they are reported. But
Yes.
normal happenings, they just keep happening around you, and nobody notices them or reports them or makes any effort about them. So
Because
you
they're
know
well established already.
absolutely. So a thousand cars may pass on the road and nobody would report it. If two of them get into an accident, that will get reported in the news, right?
Precisely.
And so
So,
that's the unusualness of things that get reported. And
because
basing our opinion on the reported things would certainly skew how you look at normal practice, because that's not how the world works.
absolutely. Just as a second example, I've mentioned the practice of sadl, which is done by the Malikiya, the Imamiya, and some of the Abadiya, which are, three major strands of Islam. You won't find a single marfu riwayat on this subject either. If you scour the books of Hadith and Athar, you will probably just think that Muslims have only practiced qabd. But the lived reality is very different. The lived reality is that sadl has been a practice from the very beginning. It was the practice in Medina. So if you simply consult the books of Ahad Riwayat, you won't find general normative practice. You will find what is special. You will find that which has to be established. You will find that which is contentious.
And that actually raises, or kind of shines some light on the concept of amma and khassa, that
Yes,
scholars tend to be familiar with these unusual things, conflicts, debates, curiosities that form their khassa knowledge, while awam doesn't, is not aware of it.
yes,
Awam just follows everything that is already well established.
yes, precisely.
And that's where the deen is precisely in the well established things.
Hmm.
Debates and then these curiosities, they tend to remain among the more learned folk, the khawas. But there is no hierarchy of which one is superior here, because this is not this distinction here that the ilmul khasa is superior and ilmul amma is inferior, right? That people who have ilmul khasa, they know better in a sense. Actually, ilmul amma is the standard knowledge,
Yes,
as opposed to this uh, ilmul khasa is knowledge which is restricted to more specific circles or specific debates or specific issues, and that's why somebody who's done more research in those areas would find those things out.
Yes, and so see, something that the scholars were making sure they kept in their minds was that anything that is reported via these specialized channels, that is being narrated on the authority of a few people. That's
Yeah.
where sanad actually comes into the discussion. If something's
And
mutawatir, it has unquestionable certitude in our tradition. Something that's ahad, as I think we've covered before in something
mhm,
related to the principles of hadith, it is zanni. It is
yeah.
in every point going to be speculative.
No, but
So,
then if in your mind you establish that there's a hierarchy between ilm al-amma and al-khassa, and khassa is somehow superior to amma, and if you were to do that and then mentally you were to invert the relationship that the khassa is going to rule the amma, then what would happen is things that have happened occasionally would end up ruling things that were happening en masse.
yes,
And
that
that is a complete inversion of how the practice should be seen, because the
absolutely.
practice as it should be seen was ilmul amma, it was the mass practice, as opposed to this on occasions, or within circles, certain uh, unusual or occasional practices may have happened. People with specialized or research based knowledge would know about them. That was their ilm al khassa, but that was not to rule over, or to decide upon what the outcome is here, because the mass itself was carrying the main body of knowledge.
I completely agree with
Yeah.
you. And insofar as this relationship is concerned, I'd just like to go on a bit of a tangent related to tafsir. You're familiar with the fact that throughout our tradition, our scholars have regarded the punishment for a muhsin committing adultery or fornication has been stoning to death. Hilariously, there is no prescription of that nature found explicitly in the Quran. Now, the distinction between a muhsin and a usual zani was made on the basis of these ahad narrations. And Imam Shafi in his Risala shows that because of ilm al-khassa, we are able to engage in something called takhsis. That is, the hukum of the Quran has been further qualified. It has been made specific to certain people, and certain people who are beyond that scope are not a part of it. This shows you the nature of this inversion. Now, that was just a general point here, but vis-a-vis the Qira'at, ahad scholarly riwayat of the canonical reciters were documented, chained, critically evaluated, and were elevated over the Qira'at al-Amma, which was mutawatir, but undocumented precisely because it was universal and unremarkable. The Qira'at al-Amma needed no chain, it was already well established. It is these ahad riwayat that required chains to establish them, because this is where you have to deal with naql ahad, where things are speculative, where debates arise. All of that requires a solid chain that can be traced back to a sahabi, which can in turn be traced back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now,
and
the scholarly apparatus
and
prioritize, yes.
and for people who might be listening, I mean,
Hmm.
it is at least my experience, I'm sure it is going to be your experience as well, and people who are listening, most likely it's going to be their experience too, that until they heard about this issue of multiple kirats, their life was when we talk about life in a sense, that their dini life, their kind of Islamic life, was going by the mass practice, the mass recitation of Quran, and there was
It's,
absolutely no question about it, right? They were not bothered about, you know, is this the original Kirat or not the original Kirat, or any questions like that. Only when once you introduce this ilmul khasa into it, then you, like you and I, and now the people who are listening, will become kind of aware of this issue, right?
yeah.
And aware of this, of these minor differences here and there, even though if you were to carry on, right, or if you or I were to carry on without actually getting introduced to this, we would have just been on the mass practice and that was it.
Yes.
and it was completely unremarkable, unmentionable. Oh no, not unmentionable. Not needing to be mentioned, and we wouldn't be reporting it anywhere. Oh, this is how I pronounce this word. There's no need to report that. Yeah, if I were to do something different, then that might be
Then
reported.
it's a point, right? And this issue has only become particularly contentious because you have certain Christian missionaries who sort of use this as an example of the Quran not being protected. But as I qualified earlier, this isn't a debate about the Quran's text. This isn't. This is a debate about how to phonetically pronounce that text. That's usually it. Because the Musaf-e Usmani doesn't have diacritic marks, it doesn't have nuqte. Now, you and I are familiar with Arabic and Urdu. Imagine for a moment if you had a script in Urdu that didn't have any nuqte. How in God's name would you vocalize that? You couldn't. A ba would become a na. Sounds would be mixed. A khe would become a jeem. A jeem would become a khe, he, or whatever else. So this is almost exactly what's happening here. This is a different question. People had already memorized the Qira'at. People had already transmitted it forward. The text is already written and preserved. This is not a debate about the preservation of the Quran. This is a different, more qualified debate about what the general reading of the Quran is. That is what this debate is about. Now, the scholarly apparatus prioritized that which was debated, not that which was agreed upon, because that which was agreed upon was simply too large, too oral, too widespread, too well established that it would have had a solitary chain. But as I'll show you, eventually a scholarly chain was developed. And in one of the great ironies of our tradition, the very feature that makes the Qira'at al-Ammah genuinely mutawatir and therefore uh, qat'iyud dalala, qat'iyus sabut, its universality, orality, embeddedness in ordinary practice are precisely the features that make it absolutely invisible to the scholarly class who are trained to look for isnad chains and contention. They only narrate things which need to be established. That which is already established will simply not be narrated. Now, why does Ghamdi identify Hafs with Qiraat al-Amma? So there are two lines of argument. The character of the chain through which Hafs reading was passed down, and the historical empirical geography of Quranic recitation across the Muslim world. Now, the chain argument. Before I just go on this slide, I'd just like to argue something else first. I just mentioned that typically the mutawatir does not have a chain. It doesn't. And as we will later identify, this reading, which we call the Qiraat al-Amma and which the general Sunni tradition regards as Hafs and Asim, was already being read in Sindh and other parts, or in fact, not other parts, the entire non-Arab world, from Anatolia to Indonesia. This was the riwayat that was being read, and most of this happened when Hafs was 4 years old.
Yeah. So
Therefore,
and of course, when something is being mass practiced, people don't think that, oh, we should write it down that it is being practiced en masse, and 500,000 people are doing this every day, because
yeah,
nobody thinks like that, and nobody kind of writes anything, any evidence like that. People just, in fact, the fact that it's being practiced by everyone makes everybody feel more secure about it, and they feel that they don't need to really document this because it's so well known. There's no point
yeah.
documenting it. If there was something more unusual, something you know some sort of an accident or some sort of a major occasion or something like that, then people would feel, okay, let's preserve this, let's record this, so that who the person who hasn't seen it or who hasn't heard it, they would find out about it. If
See, because
everybody is doing something, if everybody hears and observes something, why would you bother with that? And that's kind of the nature of mass practice.
yes, because documenting mass practice is something that's redundant, right? It's already established. So you only document things which need to be established or which there is debate about. So when we look at the chain of the riwayah that we associate with Qiraat al-Amma, we are not saying that this Qiraat was spread through this chain. As I will later show you, Hafs was 4 when Sindh was conquered, and he became a Qari much later. And by that point, Iran had already been conquered. Other areas of the non-Arab world had already been conquered. So our argument is not that this was transmitted forward through Hafs. No, this was already transmitted well before Hafs was born. It had already been practiced widely and was the only qiraat that had tawatur. It is just that once Hafs became a qari, he, as I will show you, just carried it forward with his epithet because other readers of the Quran exercised something called ikhtiyar. Now, Hafs, the chain of his narration is Ali ibn Abi Talib taught the Quran to Abu Abdul Rahman as-Sulami. Abu Abdul Rahman as-Sulami was appointed as the Qari of the great mosque of Kufa by Sayyidina Usman himself. Az-Zarkashi and Al-Baghawi record that his reading was the agreed upon recitation of all major companions, Zaid, Ali, Umar, Usman, Abu Bakr, and was the Arza Akhira, that is the final recension of the Quran that the Prophet put into practice. Asim ibn Abi Najud was in turn taught by Abu Abdul Rahman as-Sulami. He received as-Sulami's readings specifically and then explicitly told Hafs when Hafs asked him. Now, see, Asim taught two people. He taught multiple people, but the two narrations from Asim that are most well known are Hafs bin Sulaiman and Abu Bakr ibn Ayyash, also known as Shoba. So the chains are Shoba and Asim, Hafs and Asim. So Hafs once asked Asim that you teach Shoba a different Quranic recitation. What do you teach me? Asim Abi Najud said, what I teach you is Abu Abdurrahman Sulami's reading, the chain that goes all the way back to Ali. What I teach Shoba is the recitation of Ibn Masud through Zir bin Hubaysh. So, first of all, there's a qualification automatically that what was being taught, Sulami only had one reading. That is well established. Throughout our books of Qira'at, it is pretty well established that As-Sulami only had one Qira'at. He was not of those who engaged in ikhtiyar. Now, Hafs bin Sulaiman transmitted As-Sulami's farsh without ikhtiyar. What's farsh? The semantic variation or the semantic mode or the semantic essence without ikhtiyar. So farsh is the semantic variations that are found, the semantic variants that are found in Quranic recitation. And then the other part is usul. Usul is simply issues of pronunciation, how to vocalize a certain word. It has no bearing on meaning. It has no bearing on semantics. Any qari can prefer whatever accent they want. There is no issue. Uh,
Any examples of these?
yes, so for example, Nafe has a particular form of idgham that does not change the meaning. Uh, Something like that is perfectly permissible, even according to Gandhi Sahab, because so long as the meaning of the Quran isn't altered, you can practice whichever qiraat you want. That is, by qiraat here, I mean the usuli qiraat. That is how to pronounce certain words. Certain people, for example, might prefer the Levantine pronunciation. Certain people might prefer the Misri pronunciation. Certain people might prefer the Hijazi pronunciation. Some might like the Kufi one. It's entirely up to them. So Hafs says, or rather, Hafs is the only Qari to have transmitted his teacher's entire reading without ikhtiyar, without farshi ikhtiyar, without editorial selection between competing semantic variants. The only major transmitter who did not exercise personal scholarly judgment on word specific variants was Hafs. And Hafs has explicitly said this. I found this quote in Adani's Al-Jami al-Bayan fi Qira'at as-Sab, which is once again a major book of this field. Hafs said that he did not differ with Asim except in one word, which is in Surat Ar-Rum, ayat 54, which Hafs reads in two ways. with a Dad maftuha like Asim, and also in his choice of a Dad madmu'a. That is the pronunciation of the letter Dad, whether it is to be pronounced harshly or whether it is to be pronounced softly. That is Dad or Dad. That's the difference. This has no impact on meaning. It's an issue of pronunciation, and any scholar of the Arabic language has a right to prefer whichever pronunciation they feel is more vocally beautiful or is clearer to understand, as in clearer for them to say. This isn't the locus of what I am saying. My point and Ghamdi's larger point is about farsh, that is the word-specific variants that cause semantic variation. Hafs is explicit. He did not disagree with what was given to him by Asim, and as I established, Asim gave Hafs only that which As-Sulami transferred, and As-Sulami's reading was only that which was the Al-Arza Akhira, the agreed upon recitation of all major companions. Now, the ikhtiyar argument. This specifically applies to farsh, word-specific variants. Nafi ibn Kasir, Abu Amr ibn Amir, Hamza al-Kisai, Shoba, Khalaf, uh, whosoever else, even Imam Abu Hanifa, all exercised personal scholarly judgment in selecting among the variants they had received. Their readings are partly a product of their own ijtihad in weighing competing transmissions. You can read any book of classical Qira'at literature or even Shadi Nasir's book on the subject. It's pretty well documented. This isn't something new. Now, Hafs and Asim, as I showed you, he did not use ikhtiyar. Now, the reason why this is important and why I've spent so much time on this is because neither Ghamdi Sahab nor Dr. Shahzad Salim have actually given any evidence of what I have just said, which is why it is important to establish this. Now, track two, the historical empirical arguments. There are four independent observations, each pointing to the same conclusion. The conclusion is that there was one Qira'at al-Ammah, that Qira'at al-Ammah later became identified as Hafs. Why? First of all, there's a normative silence. Islamic historiography, as I showed you, does not record what everyone is doing. The Qira'at al-Amma was beneath the threshold of documentation precisely because it was universal and unremarkable, like the near absence of hadith documenting prayer without Rafa Yadain. Then there is the testimony of a geographical historian, al-Bashari, who operates in the 4th Islamic century, that is the 300 Hijrah, and he documents variant scholarly readings in every Arab territory and none whatsoever in virtually all non-Arab territories. The only logical explanation of this, as I will go on to establish, is that the communal reading was so universal that it never made news. Thirdly, the chronological argument. Sindh was conquered in 711 CE by Muhammad bin Qasim. Hafs bin Suleiman was approximately 4. Whatever the non-Arab world was reciting from the beginning could not have been a product of this scholarly network. Hafs gave the Qiraat al-Amma a name, he did not create it. He gave it an ahad chain because no one, mind you, no one bothered to learn the Qiraat al-Amma with a chain because it was universal. He is the only person, as I have shown you, who carried forward a reading without ikhtiyar. From one angle, this can be seen as a form of redundancy. But I suppose Asim's larger purpose was to teach his stepson a Sulami's Qira'at, and a Sulami's Qira'at should have been documented. I believe that is the reason why he taught this. That a Sulami, because he was such a major transmitter, his for all official purposes, for all sanad related purposes, I suppose Asim may have wanted the connection between himself and a Sulami to be more well known. Because Sulami, as I showed you, was a major Qari. He was sent to Kufa specifically to teach the Al-Arza Akhira by Usman. And lastly, the Fatiha test. Malik versus Malik. The riwayat of Hafs, Khalaf, Yaqub, and Al-Kisai. These are all Kufi variants. All of them pronounce Maliki Yawmiddin as Maliki Yawmiddin. Every other, and I repeat, every other qiraat on earth pronounces Maliki Yawmiddin as Maliki Yawmiddin. If the non-Arab world had ever recited a non-Kufan tradition and switched, every Muslim who prayed would have noticed there is no record of such an occurrence anywhere in the Islamic world. Anywhere. Where Maliki Yawmiddin was, or Maliki Yawmiddin was overnight substituted for Maliki Yawmiddin. Nothing of this nature happened. Now, al-Bashari versus the non-Arab territories. In Ahsan al-Taqasim fi Marifat al-Aqalim, a 10th century, that is in CE terms, uh, geographical history of the Muslim world. So, Aqalim al-Arabiya records the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, the Maghrib. The Maghrib is once again North Africa. So the result of this is al-Bashari records that there are variant scholarly readings in every Arab territory. Makkah reads Ibn Kasir, Yemen reads Asim, Iraq, all seven canonical readings are present. Egypt, Nafi, predominantly. And then in Damascus, Ibn Amir is being read. Right? In Aqalim al-Ajam, that is the regions of the Mashriq, Delam, Rihab, Khuzestan, Faris, Kirman, Sindh, no variant reading is recorded. Other than Al Jabal, which already had a scholarly network, literally nothing about Quranic variants is mentioned. And you can't say he didn't know anything about these places. He explicitly says Sindh follows the madhab of the Ahlul Hadith. There are Shias in Multan. There are Hanafis in villages. But on the matter of readings, there is complete silence. The sole exception is Al Jabal, which had a scholarly network because he mentions that three or four variant readings were being read by some scholars there. Conclusion. The only logical explanation is that it was the Qira'at al-Ammah which existed and which never made news, being something very common. Because, and this is important, Marjan van Putten and company disagree with this a lot, but the point is, namaz was still being read, the Quran was still being taught, worship was still taking place, there had to be some Quranic recitation in vogue in the non-Arab world. Someone had to read something during prayer. Why didn't they? If, according to Marjan van Putten, there is what he described as this was on Twitter and Reddit. He described it as orthographical variance or even phonetic variation that caused a flurry, something of this nature. Well, then the question is, as we will show, some residue must be left over from that, right? Because al-Bashari's dialogue with the Qadi of Zabid actually shows us that there was a Qira'at al-Amma, that there was a preferred reading of the masses, that this was a concept that existed insofar as the 10th century is concerned as well. And what is that? The Qazi of Zabid says to al-Bashari, are you not of those who have met scholars and pious people while most of them forbade individual readings and preferred the reading of the masses, the Qira'at al-Amma? Al-Bashari replied, yes, but when I traveled and met the chief readers, I wanted to read under their tutelage and benefit from them. Yet, when I would read by the reading of the masses, al-Jaiz, they would not give me importance and consign me to their students. When I read on an individual reading, they would welcome me, and what would they welcome him as? As a scholar. So, even in the Arab scholarly world, authorities actually prohibited people from following individual readings and urged them to adopt the Qiraat al-Amma. The scholarly readers themselves distinguished between the communal reading, permissible for all, and the specialist readings, markers of scholarly prestige. Considering the Qiraat al-Amma was something this unremarkable during al-Bashari's time, it stands to reason that of course he wouldn't pinpoint what was being read in the non-Arab world. They were reading the normal variant. That is all it was. This does not mean that no settled that there was no settled Quranic recitation in the non-Arab world. And there's further evidence for this. First of all, the Fatiha test. The single most concrete and empirically testable argument in this entire case, as I told you, is that every Qari of the Quran other than Hafs, Khalaf, Yaqub, and Al-Kisai insists that it is Maliki Yawmiddin. Tabari goes as far as to say that Maliki Yawmiddin is wrong because on the basis of the ahad, you can obviously make takhsis and tarjih of which pronunciation or which semantic variant is preferable. Because after all, um, in the traditional paradigm, takhsis could be made and indeed was. So, what a switch would require, let's say for a moment that there were vast amounts of Quranic variants across the non Arab world. All those Aqalim al Ajam, let's say that they all read something different. In fact, let's say every village read something different. Let's just completely go overboard. And for whatever reason, whether it was because of the Ottoman standardization, whether it was because of the influence of the Fiqh Hanafi, whether it was because of the 1924 Cairo edition, or any other mechanism on earth, every Muslim who prayed would have noticed every Imam who changed his recitation in congregational prayer. They would have been questioned. Some historical occurrence would have been documented. No memoir, no fatwa, no letter, no chronicle in any language from Iran to Indonesia records anything about the Fatiha being different at any point in time. And this entire place had a famous intellectual milieu. Bashari says that Delam is part of the is part of the Aqalim al-Ajam. Well, just for reference, you have Musnad al-Dailami, written by a scholar who was natively from Delam. Al-Hind, right? You have Al-Muttaqi al-Hindi, who wrote Kanz al-Ummal. You have Qazi Sanaullah Panipati, who granted is a later scholar, but you have people who were present here. You have countless court scribes in the Delhi Sultanate, in the Ghori Sultanate, in the Ghurid Sultanate. Somewhere, something should have been recorded. It isn't. In fact, you even have Ibn Battuta, for God's sake, traveling the entire world. Even he doesn't record a difference. So the point is, they were already saying Malik. They had always been saying Malik. There was never a point where they had said Malik. Now, this is the final part, answering the objections. So there are certain objections that can be raised by, once again, I know I'm quoting Marjan Van Putten a lot. This is because I have spent the past 24 hours combing through what he says on the subject on Twitter, Reddit, books, even Shadi Nasser to some degree. Answering the objections, the Ottoman thesis, the manuscript evidence, the 1924 Cairo Codex, and the argument from microvariation. First of all, was Hafs judicially imposed? That is, was it enforced at any point by the state? Before we look at Hafs and whether or not there is evidence for this, I want to consider a different case example. That is the case of the Maliki madhab, which imposed the Qira'at of Nafi in the Maghrib. Malik ibn Anas's preference for Nafi was well known, and the legal apparatus around Malik, which primarily consisted of Sahnun, actively carried it forward. Sahnun told the people of North Africa that the Qira'at preferred by Malik is Nafi's. And eventually, as various kingdoms were established in the Maghrib, several Qadi al-Qudat imposed Nafi's reading. The scholarly record shows controversy. The oral landscape today shows residual microvariation. Certain villages in North Africa continue to recite Hafs. Barely an hour away, different villages are reciting Nafi. Even within Nafi, certain people are reciting Nafi via Varsh, or certain people are reciting Nafi via Qalun. Pockets preserving distinct readings, communities remote from Maliki enforcement maintain ancestral practice. Now, given that we have considered this, and we have shown that whenever there is some form of an imposition, it will not go unreported. We have the scholarly record and the scholarly apparatus to show documentation of such an imposition. An intellectual milieu exists, even in what can be considered the non-Arab world. It exists. As I told you, Muttaqi al-Hindi existed. As I told you, court scribes and historians existed. And as al-Bashari himself showed, there were Ahnaf, there were Ahlul Hadith, there were scholars in Sindh, Multan, and other parts of the Ajmi world. Now, no record of imposition. There is no documented degree, enforcement mechanism, or scholarly controversy generated by any imposition of Hafs anywhere in the non-Arab world. The Maliki case proves Islamic scholarly culture records impositions when they occur. Even the imposition of theological beliefs is recorded. We know precisely when Iran became Shia. We know precisely when the Mu'tazila propagated the belief of Khalq al-Quran and engaged in the Mihna. We know precisely when these things happened. The absence for Hafs is a genuine asymmetry that cannot be reconciled with the way the Islamic tradition works. It is a discursive tradition. It isn't easy. In fact, it is impossible to centrally enforce something in this tradition. People have tried, they have failed horribly. Furthermore, no Hanafi canonization exists. If you try to draw an equivalency between Malik ibn Anas's preference for Nafi and a Hanafi preference for Kufi Qira'at, let me just make something clear. The Hanafi school, for better or for worse, agrees on virtually nothing. The Hanafi school had no uniform position on which Qira'at is preferable. In fact, you even have a particularly unique Qira'at attributed to Imam Abu Hanifa himself with a solid chain which is different from every other Qiraat on earth. He differs with every other Qiraat on 36 points. One would reason that the Hanafi school would likely enforce the qira'at of its founder. That did not happen. Furthermore, we know for a fact that some Hanafis preferred Khalaf, others preferred Shoba, others preferred Hafs. Zamakhshari, who was a Hanafi himself, writing in Iran, preferred, I believe, Ibn Kasir al-Makki. But I can say for certain he did not prefer a Kufi riwayat. He did not. The precise one is it has skipped my mind, but he did not prefer a Kufi one. Hafs was not canonized by the dominant legal school of the regions where it prevails. Judicial imposition cannot explain this. And lastly, in the non-Arab world, there are no pockets of alternative readings. In the Maghrib, I have shown you and told you, and this is something that is well known, that there are different variants scattered throughout different cities, different villages, different communities, different ethnicities throughout North Africa, right? In a region that is as large, spanning from China, which had the Hui Muslim community, Indonesia and Anatolia and everything in between, including the Indian subcontinent, one would expect there to be some pockets of alternative readings, right? If something was imposed in place of another. However, no village in Sindh, no community in Khorasan, no enclave in Java or Bengal preserves any distinct reading wheresoever, other than, and this is something important, crucial, the Ahl Ilm. That is it. If I go to if I go to, for example, Darul Uloom Kurangi in Karachi, I will find Qurra there reading 10 Qiraat. I will find them. If I was particularly good at Qiraat, I could even get an ijaza. But I can guarantee no normal Muslim who can trace his lineage here, let's say he can solidly trace his lineage back 1,000 years, will ever tell you that he was aware that there's any other variant reading of the Quran. Categorically. You have Sufi Khanwade that have been present here. They can categorically record their presence in the region and their scholarly tradition going back 1,000 years. They don't record anything of this nature either.
And there is a tendency as well when you impose something, there's always resistance.
Absolutely. There's resistance. Someone would say something. You cannot convince normal people that there are different ways to pronounce the Quran without telling them what the Ahraf are, without telling them that Suyuti records 40 different opinions, without telling them that uh, Adani said something, Al-Jazari said something, Al-Razi says something else. You will have to comment on all of those. You can't convince them without it. And furthermore, for all practical purposes, as we saw, Islam spread to Hind fairly consistently. As we know, Hind is a very diverse region, right? There's South India, there's Muslims in Sri Lanka, for God's sake. All of those places were clearly transmitted Hafs, or what became known as Hafs, because that's all that's ever been found there. Not a single shred of evidence, documented, undocumented, oral tradition, otherwise, records anything about different qira'at in the Ajmi world. Now, the standard academic narrative. Did the Ottomans impose Hafs? If it is said, and this is complete speculation, by the way, there is, in fact, Marjan van Putten admitted that no work has been done on this. Ottoman imperial policy standardized Hafs as a top-down imposition. This is speculative. There is no evidence of this, but I'm just considering this for the sake of an argument.
Are they arguing that it was imposed or it was adopted?
Both. That because the Ottomans formed the bulk of the mashayikh of that era after they became an established empire, just like the Abbasi school, so just as the Abbasi empire propagated the fiqh of Imam Abu Hanifa, similarly, these guys propagated the riwayah of Hafs. Okay, so let's just say why this isn't possible. The first is it does not account for all the geographic territories. Ottoman control did not produce scholarly conformity. First of all, the Ottomans never ruled India, they never ruled Iran properly, and they also never ruled Central Asia. Yes, Suleiman the Magnificent ventured into Iran. Yes, he did, I agree. But that does not equal rule. In fact, if you read the stories of how exactly his campaign went and how exactly the people of Persia avoided him, they had no standardized control over Iran. And just for uh, an argument, they had no scholarly control over China, and they had certainly no scholarly control over Indonesia. None whatsoever. However, what did they have control over? There was Ottoman hegemony over the Arab world and North Africa. Despite the fact that North Africa had been ruled by the Hanafis for about 400 years by the time Ibn Ashur could enumerate variant readings practiced among scholars, no comparable scholarly conformity was produced. That is, the Ottoman hegemony over that region did not destroy or relegate to obscurity the reading of Nafi. Didn't happen. So if this argument is made that because of Ottoman hegemony, the entire non-Arab world just somehow switched, well, we know a solid place where we absolutely know a certain qira'at was imposed, where we absolutely know why it was imposed, and we have no record of the Ottomans producing scholarly conformity there. None. And furthermore, the Ottomans were the first properly non-Arabized dynasty. The reason why you'll find variant readings among the Abbasiya, the Fatimiya, the Mamluks, and even the Seljuks is because in any book of history, you will be able to extrapolate the fact that all of the empires I mentioned were Arabized. They had actual ties to the Arab scholarly tradition. They gave patronage to them. Ottomans were the first proper dynasty to start from a non-Ajmi place, that is Anatolia, expand to the Arab world and North Africa. They were properly Ajmi, non-Arab. In a way, their predecessors were not, because the Seljuks, even though they have an ethnic similarity, being Turks, they had become Arabized. They ruled Aleppo. Their sultans lived in Aleppo. They were Arabized. On the other hand, the Ottomans formalized whatever as their imperial standard. The non-Arab world was reciting that. Before the Ottoman period, the Ottomans simply adopted what was already being recited there. The Ottomans formalized as their imperial standard what the masses among whom they lived already knew. The non Arab world handed Hafs to the Ottomans. That's all that happened. And then Van Putten and peers admit they cannot explain the mechanism. Ottoman standardization is explicitly speculative, an inference to fill a gap, not a finding supported by any positive evidence. There is no documented decree, no enforcement mechanism, no scholarly controversy. It is a hypothesis and an increasingly bizarre one. Because this means that the Ottomans, who by the way did have a literary record, had a literary record, nothing is found in that about this. Nothing.
So whenever you are doing any kind of imposition, it leaves a trace, right?
Yes,
So if they had imposed, Hanafi fiqh as law, for example, it would leave a trace.
it did. You have
And
Mashai.
and the place, sorry, as the territory that they were ruling, uh, it wasn't that there were no Muslims living there, or they were not praying, or they were not reciting Quran. If they were already reciting Quran and they come along and then say, now we are going to change your recitation, it will leave a trace. And then
Hmm.
you can show from that look, they came and they imposed, and um, you know it
Yeah.
got resistance, or people documented it, and it showed that a deliberate effort was made to change people's recitation and
I
force them to
can give
conform.
you an example of Ottoman imposition of certain law. I'm sure you've heard that Suleiman the Magnificent created his own legal code known as the Qanun-e-Suleimani. We have records of how that was imposed. So if the Ottomans were engaging in some great intellectual challenge to impose and propagate Hafs all throughout the world, then, well, there's no evidence. Even though the Ottomans typically record such impositions. And just another point. Hilariously, if you look at the Golden Horde, which was an exclusively Mongol group of converts, right? People have traveled to their lands. You'll find the odd historian in our intellectual tradition going to those lands. They record prayer. Those historians, they record heavy drinking. They record a lot of different practices which were morally reprehensible to them. But what they also record is that they were praying. They don't record is what Qira'at was being read. I mean, if one believes this hypothesis, it's purely ridiculous to say that the Ottomans imposed Hafs. Muslims in Chechnya to this day recite Hafs. The Ottomans never ruled there.
I mean,
It makes
going by, purely probability, if there were so many variations Quranic reading, and they were spreading across territories, not through the rulers but through scholars, we would have a mosaic, or we would have like a mixture of readings all across the world. We wouldn't have like a skewed version of it
I mean,
that we see right now.
you are familiar with the way the scholarly tradition in India has functioned, right? You are aware of how Shah Waliullah's school came into existence. You're aware of the intellectual tradition before that. You're aware of the Deobandi Barelvi split. Are you seriously telling me that when such a split occurred, no one preferred a different reading?
Yeah, I mean, they would have preferred a different reading just in opposition of the other group.
Yes. There were competing identities, for God's sake. Why did the Shias of Multan not adopt a different reading? Why did the Ahlul Hadith of Sindh apparently not adopt a different reading? We have records of how um, we have records of how Abdullah Shah Ghazi entered Sindh in Tafsir in Tarikh at-Tabari. His mazar exists a few minutes away from where I live. The point is that that man was also probably just reading the Ajmi Qira'at, wasn't he then? He was from Arabia, he migrated. His intellectual tradition is still preserved in his mazar. His followers continue to safeguard whatever he had written, whatever letters are extant, whatever is attributable to him. Why do they not record any qira'at? He definitely prayed.
And the thing is that all these computing schools in the subcontinent and the neighboring territories,
Yeah,
now the scholars are aware of these things, right?
yes,
And if they wish to propagate,
they
uh,
could have.
a particular chosen variation of the reading, they could have done that. But
When
instead we are not seeing that difference here.
when Aurangzeb Alamgir imposed Fatawa Alamgiriya, he could have imposed Hafs as well. Didn't happen. No evidence. He could have, in fact, he could have preferred something else. He didn't do that either. There's no evidence anywhere in the non-Arab world where any reading was ever propagated. In fact, there is no evidence that Hafs was ever actively imposed anywhere. And barring the Maghrib, there is no record of any Qiraat being imposed anywhere else. Ever. Now, objection number three, Van Putten and the manuscript evidence. This is the most serious academic challenge, which I concede warrants some seriousness. The objection is, Marjan van Putten says, Hafs does not appear in early vocalized manuscripts from the first 4 centuries. Even Farsh variants unique to Hafs rarely appear as primary readings. Warsh and Abu Amr dominate the manuscript record. So these are three things I'd like to qualify. First of all, the manuscript tradition is an elite scholarly artifact. Muslim historians have typically recorded that people weren't necessarily literate in the Muslim world, and certainly not literate specialists the same way Ahl al-Ilm were. embedded in regional scholarly reading traditions. The dominance of Warsh and Abu Amr in manuscripts tells us what Arab scholarly circles were writing. It does not tell us what the Muslim masses were reciting, because the Muslim masses were never reciting from a manuscript. Most of them couldn't read. Van Puten's methodology
I mean,
is
even if they could read, the mass tradition is not to have like a copy of Quran in their hand and then be reading from it. It's they memorized parts of the Quran which they read in prayer, or the
yeah,
Imam reads in prayer, or
yes.
they stand behind the Imam during Ramadan, and he's reciting the Quran, and that's how Quran is recited most of the time.
And
It's not that people have like a copy of Quran with them all the time, and they pull it out, or in hotel rooms you open the drawer and there's a copy of Quran sitting there, and then you pick it up and then you read it from there. That's not how Muslims go about reading Quran.
and in fact, I'd just like to add something to that. First of all, the reason why we have copies of the Quran with such, in such an amount today is because of the printing press. Manuscripts are expensive. Manuscripts are exclusively elite. And what I'd like to further point out, as I know this is getting a little bit bizarre, but it is what it is. The Qira'at al-Ammah lived in mouths, not manuscripts, right? Absence from the early vocalized manuscript record is not evidence against evidence against Hafs as the popular oral reading. It is evidence of what the popular oral reading was not, a scholarly manuscript tradition. Now, when we talk about the scholarly manuscript tradition, as I said, you have countless scholarly traditions present in the Indian subcontinent, right? Among them, you have the Huffaz, right? People who send their children to memorize the Quran by heart. There is no shortage of such people in the subcontinent, right? These Huffaz have chains that go back to the very origin of Islam in the subcontinent. Hilariously, none of them record anyone other than Hafs, as that is, even in their living tradition, they do not record the fact that at any point in time, some Hafiz in Lahore decided to teach the Qira'at of or forgive me, not teach, decided to recite the Qira'at of Nafi for Taraweeh. He might teach the Qira'at of Nafi to fellow Huffaz. That might happen. I'm not saying that didn't happen. That did happen. In fact, it's happening as we speak. I meant to normal people. Didn't happen. Simply didn't happen. And we have records that date back, without exaggeration, 1,000 years that tell us that the only reading that was ever taught here was Hafs. The ulama of the subcontinent have very, very prestigious isnad going back to very learned men. So Van Putten cannot explain Hafs's dominance. If Hafs was as obscure as the manuscript tradition suggests, that no one knew Hafs, its adoption would have required imposing an unfamiliar reading on hundreds of millions of people, generating exactly the kind of controversy the Islamic scholarly culture reliably produces.
No, but
If
then
we were,
it kind of seems self-contradictory in the sense that if you are relying on manuscript, then how
hmm,
do you explain dominance later on?
that's what I'm telling
Because
you.
if you don't have manuscript, then manuscript driven dominance cannot come later on.
Yes, it can't, and that's the question.
That's the question, right?
Because this entire debate,
So
and
you can't really base it on manuscript.
no, you can't. Simply can't. And we know people were flogged for non-canonical recitation. And I'm just saying, given the way Muslim empires have been, and Muslims, I can say this about my tradition, have been in the subcontinent, a lot of people would have been flogged. Probably lynched. I'm not kidding. The imposition of Nafe in North Africa is documented. For Hafs, there is nothing. The silence is not suppressed dissent. It's just never happened. It is people who never asked to change anything because they already had the reading. You cannot pinpoint any moment in time when Hafs gained currency in India or when it gained currency in Indonesia. or
The
Chechnya.
silence is not absence of evidence. It's basically, the absence of objection. So nobody's
Yes.
objecting because there's no need to object.
I mean, tell me honestly, someone would have lynched someone if they heard a different qiraat of the Quran. Would have happened somewhere. Ibn Shannabuz was flogged. Countless people have been flogged. You have obscure people like Mansur al-Hallaj saying an al-Haq and they are killed and their statement is recorded. And you're telling me that an entire shift, a cultural shift in how the Quran is recited simply won't be? Really?
People would record that in history, right? So it would be an event. It would be known. It would be part of how
Not just known,
history is
it would
told.
be very well known. I mean, again, right? If we have obscure Sufia and their statements recorded, because they generated controversy, one would assume that something as serious as a change in the Quranic recital would have been recorded, especially when you preach that the Quran is absolutely preserved, dot for dot, word for word, sound for sound.
And it would generate this kind of controversy would
Yes,
generate the kind of resistance which leaves a trace, which creates variation, which creates pockets, which creates groups who stick to one thing or the other,
yes,
right?
yes,
And you can never eliminate them.
you absolutely cannot. And that is exactly what happened in North Africa. There was an imposition, Hafs is still being read. There was an imposition of Nafis, someone else imposed Abu Amr. Now that's being read. But you will then find that Nafi is being read a few kilometers away. So there's a lot of variation in North Africa. That is the only region where it exists. The Out of the 1.5 billion Muslims that live, most of them live in Asia and have always lived in Asia. This isn't a modern phenomenon. Nothing. Literally nothing. It now. Objection 4. Did the 1924 Cairo edition create Hafs's dominance? In 1924, the Azhari Committee, that is Jamiatul Azhar's committee, documented rationale for selecting Hafs's prevalent. Hafs was prevalent. Oh, forgive me, that's a spelling error, but they essentially documented Hafs for the first time formally and decided to issue a codex known as the 1924 Cairo edition, which was the first proper printed version of the Quran. Now, the scholars of Azhar were obviously aware of multiple readings. They were taught different readings in the Azhari curriculum. They selected Hafs on the basis of prevalence. It was already what people were reciting. This isn't explicitly stated to my knowledge, but I'll tell you why this is the only thing that could have happened. If, as Van Putten says, the Qira'at of Hafs was obscure and no one really knew about it, no one cared about it, then the Azhari selection of that obscure minority reading over established scholarly traditions would have been controversial, would it not? That you've selected now leaving the more established narrations of Abu Amr or and various other people. Forgive me, there's just a lot of names now. But let's just say Ibn Kasir al-Makki's narration was a lot more established in the manuscript edition than Hafs was. Um, Abu Amr ad-Duri, his recitation was a lot more established in scholarly circles than Hafs was. If Hafs was the obscure minority reading, why in God's name would the Azhari committee select this for the first proper mass circulated printed Quran? Please, I
I
would
mean,
love to
if
hear
if
a
if they if,
justification.
if they would do anything like that, that would only generate controversy,
Yes,
because on the other side would be ulama of everywhere else, and they would say, why are you going, why are you doing this, right? So that would only be a matter of controversy, not just within the awam, but also within the scholarship.
yes, absolutely.
If they chose something that was the most prevalent one, that would be the most unnoticeable event,
Yeah,
right?
that's what's consistent with.
Which would generate the least amount of
Yes.
resistance.
So just as a little bow, Van Puten's account requires Al-Azhar selected an obscure minority reading without justification, overriding established scholarly traditions with no protest from scholars trained in alternative readings. Ghamdi's account requires that Al-Azhar formalized what was already universal. The committee did the obvious thing. The Azhari scholars trained in multiple readings raised no objections because they too knew Hafs was already what everyone read. That is only, the only conclusion that is in congruence with the situation we have today. The only thing that matches history. Otherwise, everything else, as I think I have convincingly demonstrated, would require a different turn of events. Would require a different series of events to transpire. So the academic alternative requires a globally dominant reading of mysterious origin imposed through undocumented mechanisms on hundreds of millions of people without generating a single recorded protest, including in the Fatiha of daily prayers by scholars who have admitted they cannot explain the mechanism of how Hafs became this popular. And mind you, this isn't just Western academia I'm talking to. This is Muslim scholars as well, certain Muslim scholars. Ghamdi's account requires none of these improbabilities. The Qira'at al-Ammah was the communal reading that spread with early Islam before Hafs was born, rooted in the companion consensus through as-Sulami, entering the scholarly record through Asim and Hafs without Farsh level editorial interference, and leaving no competitors because it was never a specialist preference. The Qira'at al-Amma was always there. Hafs only gave it a solitary chain by which it could become part of the scholarly tradition. That is all that happened, and my hypothesis is that this was done deliberately by Asim to preserve his link with Abu Abdurrahman as-Sulami, who was a venerable Qari of the Quran.
All right, thank you very much. I think nothing more needs to be said on this because I think how we've concluded this, that should give people enough to think about, that they should be able to make their minds about it, and see why this is actually a non-debate. All this
Yes,
controversy about something that people
that
had never bothered about, and that's the big point.
yes,
It's them they are bothering
crucially.
about.
Yeah,
It People never bothered. Muslims never bothered about it. All
no.
right, cool. So thank you very much on that note, and enlightening us on this topic. So I will conclude the session here and thank everyone who's listening.